You're listening to the Hayek Program podcast. This podcast includes audio from lectures, interviews, and discussions from scholars and visitors of the F.A. Hayek Program for Advanced Study in Philosophy, Politics, and Economics at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. To learn more about the Hayek Program, visit hayek.mercatus.org. To learn about graduate student fellowship opportunities with the Mercatus Center at George Mason University for students at Mason as well as at universities across the globe, please visit students.mercatus.org.
Today is Wednesday, May 1st, 2019. I'm Peter Boettke. I am the director of the F.A. Hayek Program for Advanced Study in Philosophy, Politics, and Economics at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. And today I have with me Professor Bruce Caldwell. He is a research professor in the economics department and the director of the Center for History of Political Economy at Duke University. And in 2019 and 2020, he will be the Distinguished Visiting Fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University. Thanks for being on with us today.
Great to be here, Pete.
So I wanted to start by asking you a little bit about CHOPE and the Summer Institute that you run at CHOPE. So CHOPE is the short name for Center for History of Political Economy. So if you could just fill us in on the plans for this summer, but then maybe some retrospective on what you've achieved so far.
Okay. Well, let's go back in time. Duke has long been known as a place where people could study the history of political economy or the history of economic thought. Crawford Goodwin, Neil DeMarchi, Roy Weintraub were all professors there. The journal History of Political Economy has been published there since the late 60s, I think. There was, starting in the late 80s, an annual conference that was sponsored by the journal. In fact, I was the director of the first conference, which was on Carl Menger, and it was to celebrate the coming of the Carl Menger papers. And I was at UNC Greensboro for many, many years. Used to go over to Duke to attend their workshops. They had a workshop during the year where people would present papers. And it struck me that this was a wonderful place, and I wanted to make sure that history of economics survived in the discipline. As we both know, history of thought is not something that is a field that is taught everywhere. A lot of places, particularly research institutions, have no historians of economics. So the idea was to try to find a place that could support work there. So I was successful in raising some funds, and we opened the center in 2008. The additional programs that the center brought included a fellowship program where people come for either a semester or a full year. Some of them are postdocs. Some of them are people who are in the last year of writing their dissertation. Some of them are mid-career scholars who come to Duke to work on a research project. We have an annual Summer Institute, and I will talk about the one that's coming up, but we've run those. I think this is going to be our 11th Summer Institute. And so the fellowship program helps to support people who are doing research. The Summer Institute is mostly aimed at people who think that they might want to go on to teach history of economics either as a freestanding course or as an add-on to whatever course they might be teaching, provide a historical dimension. So we aim that then at, the reason that we do that at Duke is, as I said, many PhD programs don't have history of thought available. So this is a way of, since they don't have it at their institutions, we just bring people to ours. So any listeners out there who are in PhD programs, either as students or as professors who are teaching in it, who you see likely candidates for such a program, we advertise for it on the Societies for the History of Economics list, SHU list, but more importantly in the various blogs. Mankew's blog always, he's very nice to give us a shout out about this, but also of course your blog, Pete, Tyler Cowan's blog, others that let people know about our summer institutes. Usually they're 2 weeks, usually in June, and I think they're pretty special. The other great resource that we've got at Duke, and one of the things that helps us attract fellows to our fellowship program, is the Economist's Papers Archive. Currently, we have, I think, 13 or 14 Nobel Prize winning economist papers there. We have the papers of the American Economic Association. We have the papers of the History of Economic Society. Among the, and many others who just don't, economists who just don't happen to have Nobel prizes. But of the people who might be of special interest, I mean, they're prominent mainstream economists like Paul Samuelson, but also among those who are part of the mainstream, we have Doug North's papers there and Vernon Smith's papers there. Carl Menger's papers are there.
Yeah.
Oscar Morgenstern's papers are there. So it's a very nice collection. So the Summer Institute, as I said, we have it each June. This particular summer, we're aiming it at directly at people who might want to teach a course in history of economic thought. So Steve Medema and I are going to be teaching it. It runs, I think, for 10 days, 2 sessions a day for about 2 hours, 2.5 hours. We gave them a bunch of readings to do beforehand that we hope they will all have done, or at least done most of the reading. And we'll talk both about content, but also about how we have set up the courses. Steve and I have been teaching, combined number of years is probably over 50. And he's done it in a large section format. I've done it in smaller section formats. I've taught it at both the master's level, but also I teach a course at Duke that is aimed at freshmen. So various levels of background of students, and just talking about how you might set up a course, how you might introduce the ideas.
Yeah, that's
different
great.
And different ways to do it, because you talk about somebody like Marx or Smith or Marshall or Hayek or anybody.
Right.
Lots of different people approach them in different ways.
Yeah, it's a great. I actually, when you were talking about the Summer Institute and the setting up of the center at Duke, I was thinking that one of the things that's really significant is I enjoy going to the HES meetings probably better than any other meeting. Yeah. If I wasn't presenting a paper, I still would find infinite number of sessions to go to that I find fascinating. And I think that the number of young people that are interested in these ideas is pretty phenomenal. And when I think about it, all the ones that I talk to, they've been at some sense either through your program or spent time at Duke and whatnot. So the 11 years of the program have been wildly successful, I think. So congratulations on that.
Well, thank you very much. But it's also been almost a consumption good for me, because it's great to have both the workshops and the people who are visiting each year, and then the summer institutes, because people self-select for these summer institutes, and the ones who come are really, really excited, and it's great to do that, and to know that there are people who are interested in the field.
So from where you began to now, can you talk a little bit about for listeners there who are PhD students that are interested in maybe making an inroads into history of economic thought as a field, some state of the field of where it stands in terms of how what the expectations are for research, what the journals are that are where they need to be pitching their research and whatnot.
Sure. So history of economic thought, or history of economics, both phrases are used, has always been a kind of a subfield within economics. Now, when I was in grad school, it was required that I take a course in it, as well as a course in economic history. I doubt there's any or many, a handful of places where that might still be true.
Can I tell a funny story about
Sure,
that? When I was at NYU, where Bill Baumel taught, but also Leslie Leontieff taught, and they decided to eliminate the history of economic thought requirement. So they used to have a history of economic thought and an economic history requirement, and then they decided to just get rid of it. And obviously, I was the one teaching the history of economic thought, so I kind of, I was a pre-tenured faculty member, so I understood that this was another, foretelling of things that were bad to come, or whatever.
Right.
So with my colleagues, we tried to get to rally up some support, and because Baumel was actually, who's a master historian of thought, was actually one of the ones leading the charge to kill, because of the Stigler kind of position that whatever's good in the ancients is actually already embodied in the moderns, and that the opportunity costs of reading the ancients is too high, kind of thing.
Right.
And so we tried to get Leontiev on board, and Leontiev agreed, and he came to the meeting all ready to get riled up and defend the position. But when it was his turn to talk, he ended up spending the whole time defending economic history. And then, someone said, Andy Schotter, who's the department chairman, said, Wesley, it's history of economic thought, not economic history. And Leontiev stopped for a minute, and he goes, that's important too. And so the vote
didn't say never mind.
The vote didn't go. The vote didn't go the way that I was hoping. But I think that's. We also at George Mason, in my second year after I returned here, got rid of the requirement.
Right.
And so I'm not sure if there's any place that requires it anymore. It's a real shame, I think.
I think there might be a couple of heterodox places that require it, that have PhD programs, but not many. Maybe some places in Europe do.
Right.
But not in the States or Canada. So many people might be then thinking, gee whiz, why do this?
Yeah.
And I think it takes a certain type of person. But the first thing I would say is it's always been a tough field. When I was coming through in the 1970s, I had two different episodes that I'd like to recount. One was when I was maybe a third-year student, and I was a pretty good student in the PhD program, and I can remember we would have beer with the professors on Friday afternoons, and this one professor who was I had taken macro seminar from, said, geez, you're so smart, what are you doing with this history of thought, this crazy waste of your talents. And I just said, I love it. So the conversation didn't go very far. But then when I was in the job market, there was a chair of one of the search committees for a school that I would have liked to have gotten an interview for. And anyway, he was sitting out in the lobby bar area, and a bunch of grad students had kind of gathered around him. And he was, I guess, trying to be personable in the way that old economists sometimes do, and he said, why don't you tell us who you are? And he went around, and I said, yeah, I'm Bruce Caldwell. I'm at UNC, and my field is history of economic thought. And he goes, history of economic thought. I've heard people say that it's a dying field, but I have a different opinion. I think it's a dead field. And all of the other students, and I felt, you son of a gun.
Yeah.
I use stronger
language
in my mind.
Yeah.
And it was actually something that made me even more determined, I think, to go ahead and do it. But yeah, it is a field that you're not going to find that many PhD programs that offer it. So if you're interested in it, coming to Duke for a summer institute is certainly something that you can do. Mm-hmm. And if you become really interested in it, the ones who come through Duke University who end up having history of economics as a field, we insist that they have another field that they can get a job easily with. Mm-hmm. Okay, just have it as a second field. And if it's something that you actually love, and it's a small number of people who are going to love it, but I think those who do should pursue their dreams. You can come, if you're enjoying it, to come as a fellow to the fellowship program in your final year. You've finished your coursework. You're doing your various essays that you do for a dissertation. If you have one that is oriented towards history of economics, and often Students do literature surveys very typically with their dissertations. There's a fine line between a literature survey, which is just this rote repetition of things that are important in a particular area that you're investigating, and one that is an actual historical piece. And we can help you write that if that's something that you want to do. And that is a really fine way to get introduced to the craft of writing a good historical paper, combining background in the field. Sometimes you can introduce, depending on the topic, archival research. There's just lots of ways you can do it. And that's what we do in our workshop. Every week we have somebody in, and we try to take whatever paper they've got and try to make it a better paper, depending on what they're starting with. So that is that's kind of to encourage people who might have the interest that they have those resources. So where do people get published? Well, it depends on very much on the field. So we bring in people who are economists, but we also bring in people who are in other disciplines, related disciplines, political science, philosophy. We've had a geographer there, classical studies person. So those will have different journals. Some people who are more interested in kind of PPE. So there are journals in PPE. There are journals in history of thought, as I said. History of Political Economy is published at Duke. There's the Journal for the History of Economic Thought, which is the HES, which is the History of Economic Society Society Journal. So there are actually a lot of outlets. There are European journals, maybe 3 or 4. There's an Australian journal, and the History of Economic Society meetings that you mentioned is actually a wonderful way for people who might be interested to dip their toes in. There's an annual meeting. It's not always. It's traditionally been at the institution of the president-elect, but we've now moved to a different model where we're trying to have them in better places. Yeah. Because if you're at a small college, it often is not a very good place to have a large meeting. And as you said, you go to those meetings and you have sessions on Adam Smith, on Marx, on Keynes, on Hayek, on Marshall, on all these people.
Yeah, it's very intellectually exciting. This year's meeting's in Columbia.
In New York,
yeah. Let me ask you another follow-up question about the publishing thing, because you've been very successful at being able to publish history of economic thought work in flagship journals like the Journal of Economic Literature.
Right.
And other people, for example, Joseph Persky had a column that he edited for the Journal of Economic Perspectives for years, and people could get articles there. Now, they might not have the same cachet as being in the AER, JPE, QJE, or Econometrica, but they reach a very wide audience, a much wider audience than, say, Hope reaches just by being the fact that it's a Journal of Economic Literature.
Right.
Do you have any advice to young scholars about how to maybe figure out how to find opportunities to do stuff like that?
Yeah. Well, something like the JEL is you have to propose a topic to the editor, and it has to be a good topic. So I have been lucky. I did one on Hayek and socialism that appeared in the 90s after the fall of the wall.
Yeah.
So that was a timely time to do that. I did one on
Popper,
clarifying Popper. And Popper is a philosopher of science who a lot of economists made reference to his work, but might not have known too much about his work. So it was an attempt to try to say what Popper had to say. And I can say now, because it's been accepted, I did one on the 75th anniversary of the publication of Road to Serfdom, so that'll be coming out. It may actually come out in the 76th year afterwards, because there is a lag time, as for most journals. But the thing is about journals, though, if your goal is to be at a top 20 or top 30 research institution, where you have to get published in the top 5 journals regularly, or at least more than once, history of thought is probably not going to be a field that you're going to pursue. You have to be a really special person to be able to combine the ability to publish in those journals, plus also do good historical work. And that's fine, but let's say you're not looking at the top 30, particularly if you're looking at a liberal arts college, uh, where journal publication is important, but so is good teaching. Uh, the ability to teach history of thought. This is a kind of course that is custom made for liberal arts colleges. So it is a bonus to have that ability on your vita. And it's a plus. I mean, this is something that could end up helping you get a decent job. Now, as I said, you also have to be a labor economist or an econometrician, whatever your particular other fields or fields are. But history of thought can also work very well with a PPE kind of background if people go in that direction, or if you have other ways of approaching interdisciplinarity. It's one of those fields that lends itself very easily to be able to work with people who are working with other fields. We had a guy who was this year who went through our fellowship program, who applied to a special program, undergraduate program, University of Chicago, and was accepted. And it's an interdisciplinary sort of program, and the fact that he came through a history PhD program, but also spent time with historians of economics and people who are also in other disciplines at Duke, I think helped him get that job.
Yeah.
And it's a great gig that he's
Right.
got. So he's really looking forward to
I
it.
think that one of the things that we've seen in the last 20 years is, and more recently, in the last decade, but in the last 20 years, I think, is the rise of honors colleges, because
Sure.
in the state universities, because people they use it as a way to recruit very good high school students, and keep them at home, and also give them the small college experience, but within the large university. So not just the way James Madison College was set up at Michigan State, but there's, like, we have an honors college here at George Mason
Right.
University with that idea. NYU had an honors program that was set up like that when I was up there. And then also now this rise of these PPE programs.
Right.
And history of economic thought is very important for that kind of work, because it's the kind of glue in those courses across, especially if you are can talk sensibly about, Smith and Marx and Mill, and because that political science,
Mm-hmm.
sociology, all of them. So I do think there's great growth opportunities. I was at LSE earlier this semester, and I gave a talk to the economics department that I was invited over to give. It was a regular faculty and everything like that, but there were a group of students there who had started on their own a history of economic thought reading group.
Good for them.
And so Tim Besley, who was my host, introduced me to them, and I started corresponding a little bit with them about how they're doing this. They just are interested in multiple perspectives in economics, because the financial crisis in many ways shook the faith that there's just one perspective, and so they want to hear the different ones. So that's another thing that's been going on as well.
Sure. Absolutely.
Okay, so one of the things that I think is maybe different, maybe the Duke project is one of the things that really helped get that off the ground, but the Economist Papers project, I mean, is because there's this collection, they're taken care of the right way, and so there's a lot of demand for archival work at the moment in doing this. So students who are trained don't just sit and read The Wealth of Nations in their dorm room and then write, things. They go and they try to do archival research. So I wanted to know if you could maybe talk a little bit about the joys and frustrations of archival work in general, and in particular with regard to your own work on Hayek. I love your getting emails from you, because you have a little saying at the end of the emails, which is about archival work. So maybe you can talk a little bit about that.
Right. So Actually, the saying is it isn't directly about archival work. It's Edwin Canaan's edited The Wealth of Nations, and he said trying to locate a citation uh, often takes hours, and not finding the citation often takes days.
Yeah,
Which was great. And of course, he. So what he's talking about there is Adam Smith might cite something, but cite it incompletely because
Right.
people didn't used to have standardized ways of citing. So he'd try to track it down, and if, like Hayek used to do all the time, Smith transposed numbers or made some other mistake, you'd have to try to find the book and then go through the book and find the cited passage. And I actually had to do that with when I was editing Hayek's Road to Serfdom, because it was before you really had just this Google search thing that
Right.
would allow you to find this stuff. So
Yeah.
I'd go through a book and sometimes read it 3 times just trying to find one particular passage.
Yeah.
Maddening. That was when I edited that little line.
Yeah, yeah.
Actually, it was when I started editing Hayek's stuff that I saw that.
If I can interrupt, you have
Yeah.
in your introduction to the definitive edition of the Road to
Yeah.
Serfdom, you have a wonderful way. It's either there or in the Abuse of Reason project. You have a wonderful way to describing how you're going to introduce your editor corrections, because you have editor corrections that you note, editor corrections that you don't note, and so it's it's really kind of amazing. Yeah,
There's
so
lots of corrections.
Yeah, yeah,
right.
yeah.
Right. So, okay, but back to archival work. So, what is archival work? Well, so Hayek has at the Hoover Institution, and one reason I'm going out there next year is to begin work on the second volume of Hayek's biography that I've been working on with Hans-Jörg Klausinger for a number of years. So, an archive is take a cardboard carton and put in a folder of papers. So these cartons, if the folders are thin enough, could hold maybe 100 folders.
Mm-hmm.
Well, he has 170 cartons, so it's just a huge amount of stuff. What kinds of stuff? Well, he has letters that he sent back and forth. That's professional correspondence. He has early drafts of papers when people wrote papers and typed them on
Right.
paper instead of on their computers. He has got notes, class notes. He's got papers from other people. He's got all different sorts of things. He had a particular habit of using 3x5 cards that he would write down things on. So there's maybe at least a dozen, maybe 15 or 20 of these boxes that have like 500 of these cards each. It's just an incredible thing. So, like empirical work, you never know what you're going to find. You could look through a box and go through folder after folder. And in Hayek's case, once he got the Nobel Prize, people would write him unsolicited letters. Here's my paper. What do you think of it? And his secretary had a standard response that said, Professor Hayek thanks you for the paper that you've sent, and he will certainly try to get to it. And if he has any comments, he will certainly get back to you. So you have lots of stuff like that. 95% of the stuff in an archive is probably stuff that's not interesting to you, depending on your research project, what you're looking for. But then you never know when you're going to find stuff that's fascinating. And so my first archival, I had trained as an historian of economics. I was of the type that you described earlier, where I would sit down and read a bunch of stuff and then try to put together an interpretation.
Mm-hmm.
Hadn't done archival work. So in the 1991, I think, was my first visit to the Hoover archive. I had written a paper on Popper. I was interested in Hayek, so I went immediately to the Popper-Hayek file. It blew me away. It's what turned me into a real historian of economics, I would say. There was the correspondence between Karl Popper and Friedrich Hayek during World War II. Popper had gone to New Zealand. Hayek was in London, and then London evacuated, the LSE evacuated to Cambridge, so he was at Cambridge. And I had read Popper's Poverty of Historicism when I was working on Popper as a research topic. I never understood the book. It started out in one particular direction.
Mhm.
Halfway through, it went somewhere else. What was he doing? Everything else by Popper is usually so well organized and straightforward. Not simple necessarily, but well argued. And it just was a mess of a book. I never understood it. Looking at that correspondence, reading through it in a day and a half, I suddenly understood. It helped me understand a text that I had not been able to make sense of. That would be the kind of sort of moment that you have of how archival work can really help you become a better scholar about some text. And what it was this. Popper had presented a paper in Hayek's seminar in the mid-30s, initiated correspondence again in the early 40s. They started to exchange back and forth papers. They came to realize that they were taking very similar approaches. Hayek was the editor of Economica and could publish The Poverty of Historicism in pieces in Economica, but they used language somewhat differently, so what seems evident is that Popper ended up changing the direction of his paper, which was not finished, halfway through. So what had happened is that Popper sent him the first of 3 installments that ended up being The Poverty of Historicism. Then after having sent off that first one and getting it starting to be published, their correspondence back and forth meant that Popper felt he needed to make his views use language that was more consistent with some of the views that Hayek had. In many ways they agreed, but in certain points they had disagreement. And here's this guy who's publishing Popper's work, so he wants to say, okay, the apparent disagreements are not so big. So that helps to explain why The Poverty of Historicism reads the way it does. So that was my first experience of just that richness. I would also just say, though, the other part that I learned on that very first visit is how cool it is to have in your hands these documents written by these big figures, and you're holding it and reading it, just as Popper did and Hayek did when they wrote to each other. It is just the coolest experience in the world. And I think if you don't think that's a cool experience, you're probably not going to be a good historian of economics, or you're not going to enjoy it. But if that does sound like something that's attractive, it is so much fun. And when I go to the archives, I've told this story before. I love to eat. I go to the Hoover, and sometimes I will get up because it opens at like 8:45. I'll skip breakfast, and if I'm working there, I'll forget about lunch. I'll just work straight through to 4:45, and when they kick me out. So it's that much fun.
I think I've told you this, is that I've had the chance to well, first I had the opportunity here to be involved in the processing of Buchanan's papers and access to all of that, and trying to get that done the right way. And now this is a little bit more too one-sided in some sense, but Buchanan's kind of a hero to me. But it's really funny because even when I first started working in those papers, he was still alive. And I can remember I got so excited because I read all this stuff about the way they were building the program at VPI. I wrote a paper on the past, present, and future of public choice. And so I was doing all this stuff, and I got all excited because it's memos from Buchanan himself. And I told him I wanted to talk to him. And so Joanne Burgess at the time used to record any time that you talked to Jim, because they wanted to put that into the archives as well. So it was a weird kind of setup. But anyway, I go in there and I'm all excited, giddy. I'm like, Jim, look at this, thing. You redesigned the curriculum of the PhD program. It's perfect the way you designed it, blah, 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 all this stuff. And he goes, now don't get so excited. He goes, that was when I left UCLA and I was escaping to the mountains. He goes, I didn't think I was there to retire. I was like, no. It's like, so it's a funny thing. But at the LSE, it's the same kind of thing. I get so excited in reading Robbins, trying what he's trying to do in the department. and you can read it, and you see the alternative offers that he's being made as a young man to go teach somewhere else or run some else, and he's like weighing all of these and stuff, and I get so excited, but I have to always discipline myself by the Buchanan voice in my head saying, I was just trying to get a raise, right? Kind of thing. So but yeah, it's fascinating. Actually, I want to ask you about that question because there's kind of a moral responsibility for archival historians in thought, similar to the kind of moral responsibility that's in also for people doing empirical work. One of my professors, Kenneth Boulding, used to like to say is that we would make more progress in science if we published the wastebaskets of other economists and doing these things. And there's obviously selection and all these other kind of things. How do we discipline the enthusiasm that we feel with archives as well?
Well, I see archives as a test of one's intuitions. I think people do come at particular topics with particular viewpoints. It's inevitable. But and sometimes you will rely on memoirs of actors about particular episodes.
Yeah.
But what's useful to test that is to go back and see what documents actually exist, whether they support or don't support a particular point of view, and then you check out documents that exist in other archives. A lot of times a particular person you're interested in, maybe the stuff that they were sending out actually isn't in their archives. It's
right.
in somebody else's archives. And so it's I think it's a way of constraining interpretations.
Yeah.
And I suppose you could ethically use I would think it would be an abuse of scholarly ethics to just cherry pick particular letters or phrases within letters to support a particular point of view, but a good historian, in my opinion, would try to read through an archives, not just find stuff that supports their priors.
It's not a game of gotcha. It's a game of exploration. Yeah.
And that's why I compare it to empirical work, because
Yeah.
empirical work constrains you too.
Yeah.
And there are ways to do bad empirical work too, obviously, to kind of cherry pick or to just reformulate the thing until you get the results you want. But I mean, that's everyone recognizes that's bad empirical work too.
So the issue of memory and human frailties is a pretty amazing thing, because the way if you're one of these people, scholars, that is established enough that people care to ask you when you're 80 to reflect back on when you're 25, it's oftentimes your memory is going to be not the full memory. And so, and you also like to tell stories about yourself that put yourself in a different light. And so, Marianne Johnson on with Buchanan, he has this, epiphany moment, like he likes to explain, which is that he was done with his dissertation, he was in the library, and then, just serendipity, he read Wicksell or whatever. And then it turns out, of course, that he was exposed to Wicksell in his first year of school. And, so that epiphany story doesn't quite work. And I also, I like to point this out because I'm a fan of Hayek's, which is that Friedman always used to say about Hayek's capital theory, and it's quoted in the Lanny Ebenstein book and everything, that, I never understood what Hayek was arguing. It was such a mess. What is that, capital theory, which may in fact be true, but he says I never understood it. But if you actually look at his syllabus from when he was in graduate school himself, taking price theory from Viner, that they actually read more Bombaverick than they read Marshall in that class from the syllabus from 32. So he was they read from Capital and Interest, which means that they read the whole 9 yards, all about roundaboutness, all these things like that he online. And so it's not that Friedman was unexposed to it. He might not agree with it, but it wasn't like the way he characterizes it. And I think you see that. What are some of the egregious examples in Hayek where his memory is so at odds with like what you find actually?
Okay. So One of them, actually, I mentioned in the editor's introduction to The Road to Serfdom, because he wrote a memo to Beveridge in 1933.
Yeah.
And in his reminiscences, he talks about that as taking place in 1937 or 38.
Yeah.
So I knew about this document that was in the archives. And the reason it's important is that it was a very early statement of some of the themes that you can find in The Road to Serfdom. But when I saw this document, and I made a Xerox copy of it, and I brought it home and read it, and in my margin of it, it says, this looks like parts of Road to Serfdom.
Yeah.
That was my reaction to it.
Yeah.
But I, of course, didn't think it was the Beveridge memo because Hayek had said the Beveridge memo was 37 or 38. Right. Yeah. Beveridge actually was gone from LSE by 38. So if I had known that, I would have immediately said, wait a second, this seems a little suspicious. But it wasn't until I was at a conference, a small conference in Cambridge, England. Larry Hayek was there, Marcia Sen, and Sue Howson was there. And Sue said, oh, I've got the Beveridge memo, because I said, yeah, I could never find this memo from 37, 38. And she said, I've got it. It was in the Beveridge papers. I've got a copy in my attic in Cambridge. So we went over and got it. And dang, if it wasn't the 33 memo. So what had happened in Hayek's head was the 33 memo. He then wrote Freedom in the Economic System, which was published in 38, and he just put that, he was just mixing up the dates. Yeah. And it was, he's responding to an interview question. And it's easy for people to make mistakes like that when they're talking off the top of their head. Yeah. And that was one that I just prevented me from seeing what was right in front of my face for a while. Yeah. And I can't think of any right off but that would be the real one, that the really big one that actually affected some of the research that I was doing. Yeah.
Now we're here this week because we're going to be having a 2-day conversation about Volume 1 of your biography and of Hayek, and you're going to be going next year, and you've been doing some of the research already. Maybe you can, without too many spoilers, tell us a little bit about the things in Volume 1, and then also in hopefully maybe in Volume 2 that we should expect to see.
Yeah. So Volume 1, Hayek lived from 1899 and died in 1992. So Volume 1 is...
I should point out that in your book, Hayek's Challenge, you have one of the great lines. I'm going to butcher it right now, but you talk about that not only is the Hayek's challenge, but the challenge to the scholar studying Hayek, because he wrote from the 1920s into the 1980s and wrote in all these different disciplines. Right. And it is amazing. It's when you realize that, you think of Hayek as sort of a modern day Adam Smith kind of idea, but at the same time, it is pretty daunting, and it's amazing that you've been able to negotiate all of this so masterfully. So I want to congratulate you on that, but also, maybe you can tell a little bit about that evolution in these biographies as well.
Sure. So I think the second volume is going to be harder because it will take us further away from economics and into fields that I hadn't. And Hans-Jörg Klausinger, my co-author, is also an economist. So neither of us have the expertise that you would like to have to deal with some of the later work. On the other hand, Hayek was trained as an economist too, so perhaps it's the way an economist would look at fields like political philosophy or methodology or things like that. But the first volume will go through World War II and probably end in 1946, and the second 47 through 92. So in the first volume, you've got his life as a kid in Vienna, his period in World War I when he fought on the Italian front, his period at the University of Vienna, the wonderful trip to New York and to America in 1923-24, where he had very strong, really negative reactions to American society, and street society in particular, that he encountered in New York. Then his period as a young economist in Vienna. Then he gets invited to London School of Economics, ends up getting a job there, has a great friendship with Lionel Robbins. The grand seminar that they ran in the 30s, when much of microeconomics was formalized to the extent of the sort of formalizations that you see in an intermediate price theory text. The start of World War II, socialist calculation debate, capital theory debates, all those things that took place in the 1930s, and then the start of World War II, where he starts the Abuse of Reason project, and out of that comes eventually the Road to Serfdom and pieces like Use of Knowledge in Society, and then the end of the war and his reunion with his whole family, not his wife and children, but the family he was born in were all still in either Nazi Germany or in Austria, which was part of Germany at that point, because of the Anschluss in 1938. So just how that all comes together. And then the second volume, there'll also be things of considerable interest, because 47 is the Mont Pelerin Society, how that came about, work on the sensory order. His divorce, his move to the University of Chicago, working on the Committee on Social Thought, Constitution of Liberty, ultimately law, legislation, and liberty coming out of that in the 70s, but the Chicago years, I guess the Constitution of Liberty being one of the big things, but also his kind of move towards investigation of spontaneous orders or complex phenomena. So Nobel Prize would be in the second volume, and his move to Freiburg and then Salzburg and Freiburg again. So there's considerable interest. We are having a division of labor, as luck would have it. Hayek spent a lot of time in English-speaking places in either the United States or England, and then early part of his life and latter part of his life, he was in German-speaking countries. So Hans-Georg is from Vienna, has the ability to get into the various archives that it needs to get into, and I think we've actually had a very, very easy collaboration thus far. We'll see. I'm really looking forward to the comments that we'll be receiving from your group.
How many
tomorrow.
languages was Hayek comfortable with?
Well, he complained that he didn't really learn French. He spoke everything, it seemed to me. He's classically trained, so he had Greek and Latin.
Wow.
He was at the Italian front, so he learned a little Italian. He translated a piece from Dutch. He spent a summer in Norway and was able to report on meetings that took place in Norwegian in Germany. That was one of his first. He was just amazing in that regard.
Yeah. What
he knew. So I don't know how many, but a lot more than me. That's for sure.
Yeah, I mean, I think on all of these elite economists, obviously you're sampling on the very far end tail of the distribution of, and so they have talents that are, quite unique, analytically, and other talents that they have to bring to bear on it. Well, it's fascinating work that you're doing, and it's a great example of scholarship. If you go back even to Hayek's challenge, I think the way that is a less archival work and more of an interpretive work, but it's a fantastic way in which you tie the unity of Hayek's program throughout that, and so in many ways. And so I just applaud you on all of the great scholarship. Maybe we can end again with the beginning and just look back in order to look forward. What I mean by that is, when you started out as your career, as you told the story, you understood the sort of risks that you were taking. There are people that will listen to this show, are people that would like to take the same kind of risks that you've taken. At some level, because people like yourself took that risk, It's a little less risky today than it was maybe when you took it. But what are some of the best lessons that you've learned in your career that you could maybe pass on to the next generation?
Sure. Well, thank you for your kind words about my work. I think if you're passionate about the particular area that you're interested in, I did my dissertation in the days when you typed it on a typewriter, and I didn't know how to type. So I would send my dissertation to my mother in Florida, who would type it up and then send it back. And of course, the fear was that it would get lost in the mail and I'd have to rewrite. Because I guess we had Xerox machines back then, but I was too stupid to even think, go ahead and Xerox it, you moron, or too cheap because it was probably a dime a copy. And in any event, I just figured my mother was really going to be the only person to ever read my dissertation, which was Beyond Positivism. It's about methodology of economics. And
it's a great book.
It turns out that there was a market for it. Yes. So sometimes you just get surprised. I began editing The Road to Serfdom, and I began as general editor of the Hayek Collected Works. It took about 2 or 3 years for each one of those volumes to be produced. So you had to check all the footnotes, just like that Edwin Canan quote stated, and then write an editor's introduction that was putting the stuff into context. That takes a long time, and I just never thought there'd be any return except the return of the scholarship for that. As it turns out, The Road to Serfdom is held up by Glenn Beck, and it sells a huge number of copies. So that was
it's a gift that keeps on giving.
It's a gift that keeps on giving. So you just never know.
Can I ask you a question about The Road to Serfdom that's separate from this? So it's a kind of an intriguing question with Hayek and The Road to Serfdom, because the condensed Reader's Digest condensed version. So Hayek is adamant that he's not writing a slippery slope kind of argument. Right. The Reader's Digest version doesn't quite present it that way, but it could be read that way. But clearly the Look cartoon one is definitely that way. And I'm sure that if I saw a cartoon version of the general theory, it would have a kind of a stripped down version that would be the silly kind of version of it, rather than a complicated version of it. And there's just, that goes with all works. If Marx, it would be like that, or whatever.
Cartoon Marxism.
Yeah, and you would get like the sort of in fact, I've seen one of them, a presentation where the worker is put into a meat grinder, and that's like the vision of what capitalism is. What do you think is the responsibility of an author of the use of their works?
Well, Popper says that once it goes out into World 3,
you have no control.
You have no control over it.
Yeah.
And I think that's pretty much right.
Right.
So you have the author's intention.
Yeah.
And as much as an author might try to put that across, if the book appears at a particular moment in time, like The Road to Serfdom did,
right,
and it gets used by particular groups in ways that Hayek was not particularly happy about, and said that. I mean, this will be in that Road to Serfdom 75th anniversary JEL piece.
Yeah.
I mean, it's clear he resisted the way it was being used, both in England and in the United States, but to no avail.
Right.
I mean, it was out there, and it was going to be used the way it was going to be used.
Yeah, it is an intriguing thing with a book like that, because when Hayek says he's writing a political book, I think I interpret him as saying that he's writing a book that is like an old-style political economy book. There's a world of difference between that and a politicized book.
Right.
And I think everyone sort of thinks he's admitting that he's writing a politicized book, but he's not.
No.
He's actually trying to write a subtle argument that is directed at a particular track of the time, but he gets pigeonholed into this. And I think actually, the look, the summary in the cartoon version has a kind of deleterious effect on the mental capacity of his critics to deal with him on his own terms.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, remember, the dedication of the book is to socialists of all parties.
Yeah.
He was worried that people who were adopting views that he thought were going to be wrong, that lead to bad things. But that's what he meant by a political book.
Right. And this goes back to your beverage memo, because it's quite clear that he's not challenging people on their ends that they're seeking. He thinks that they are pursuing means which are
inimical to the ends.
Yeah, and as a result, that's like, don't do this. It's a warning to them. And so anyway, it's fascinating. I mean, this is a great project that you're doing. I'm so happy that it's going to be in the JEL. But so that's kind of serendipity to the young people.
Right.
But how about like how to maybe just, if you have any ideas about ways for them to build a career in this field and try to put themselves in the best position to enjoy scholarship, enjoy their teaching, and have a nice life in academics.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it doesn't have to be history of economics. Just if you're going to become an academic, it is in some ways, I think it's a tougher life now than it was when we came up, because I did anticipate getting a job, even though I was an historian of economics. That was a tenure track job, whereas today it's increasingly you have adjuncts teaching. So I mean, I think it is a tougher row to hoe these days. But as I said, if you're interested in this field, there are ways to get to find out whether you're interested by coming through some of the programs that we've got at Duke, and there are other. I mean, George Mason is a wonderful example of a place that has a very, very exciting, rich, interesting set of ways to do economics that are outside what you'd get in a boring, mainstream, traditional PhD program in economics. And everyone recognizes that, not just people who are fanboys like me, but people well outside who are in mainstream programs.
Yeah.
People say that to me all the time. Now, you're going up to GMU, that's great.
Yeah.
They're excited about it.
I do think one of the really exciting things about your program, and this is, well, I want you to react to this and then we'll wrap things up, which is that just with yourself, Kevin Hoover and Steve Medema there, and of course in the older days past, individuals like Crawford Goodwin and Roy and Neil, but Crawford Goodwin especially, I recommend to everyone. There's a special issue of Hope, which has articles by Crawford in it, and plus some reflections by other people, and it's really he was a special person in academics, a sort of a real gentleman in the classic sense of that. But you also, with Kevin Hoover, and Steve Medema and yourself, you have three people that are really dedicated to scholarship and believe seriously in the craft of the historian of thought. And so you have a fantastic core for people to go and be exposed to, and that's part of what is the draw there. Besides the economist papers, the literal resources that you have for people to work on, which is phenomenal. You also have this rich culture of individuals dedicated to scholarship, and I think it really serves as a fantastic beachhead for history of economic thought. And so just put in one last pitch for coming through the Duke programs and the various benefits that they can get from it.
Right. So you mentioned Steve Medema, and he is teaching in the Summer Institute, but until this very day, he was not a member of the faculty at Duke. But I just got an email that the offer was accepted, so he is now a Duke faculty member.
That's fantastic.
So Kevin Hoover, Steve Medema, and Bruce Caldwell are all faculty members at Duke. And we do enjoy what we do. So have a look at our website, see what our programs are. If you have any questions, send me an email.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Bruce. It's great having you on this.
A real pleasure to be here, Pete. Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you for listening to the Hayek Program podcast. To learn more about the research, scholars, and work of the Hayek Program, visit hayek.mercatus.org. For more information about graduate student fellowship opportunities for students at Mason as well as at universities across the globe, please visit students.mercatus.org. We hope you recommend students to our programs or consider applying yourself.